Good morning. On our continued reading, we begin the book of First Kings today. And like First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings may have at one time been one book of history. And while these books, First and Second Kings, deal a lot with the monarchy and the reign of Solomon and kings that way, there are also some good moral teachings, and we continue to see God at work in and through this. And so as I said, it's mostly political history, but there are moral and religious undertonings in it. As we begin, it says that King David is old and advanced in his years, and even though they covered him up, he couldn't get warm. He was always cold, and this is a sign of old age when our the hearts pump less and our arteries we can't get enough heat pumped around through our bodies. But so they go and they find this young girl, a virgin, to come and to take care of David and to share his bed, to warm him up, and to try to body heat. I mean, body heat is a great thing to warm you up when you're cold. But it says that David did not know her sexually. He did not have intimacy with her. He did, whichever kind of wording your Bible might use that way. But she served him and did her best for him. And while King David is languishing now and being probably less able to rule, his I think second oldest son Adonijah decides that it's time for him to become king. The older brother had been killed, when a while back, and I can't think of his name right now. But anyway, this guy decides it's time for him to become king. So he enlists 50 men and he and some horsemen and 50 other men to run ahead of him, and he goes and he installs himself as a king. He offers the sacrifice of sheep and goats, and I don't remember. There's 3 different things, and he had talked with Joab, the leader of the army under King David, and he had talked with this priest Abiathar, and they supported him. And so they went and did this, and it says here he offers sheep, oxen, and fatted cattle by the stone, but he says, here's that little 3-letter word, but, throwing a thorn into things. He didn't invite Nathan or Benaiah or any of the warriors, the mighty warriors, and he didn't invite his brother Solomon. But he was installing himself as king and having a feast. And Nathan hears about it, and Nathan goes to Bathsheba. Rather, doesn't go to David right away, but he goes to Bathsheba. Nathan has got some wisdom. We've been witnesses of that in how he, handled David's sin with Bathsheba early. But he goes to Bathsheba and he says, you remember that David promised you that your son Solomon would become king after him. Well, now his brother Adonijah has tried to do himself up as king, and he is proclaiming himself king, and they're having a royal feast. And I think you, Bathsheba, need to go and talk to King David and remind him of that promise that you made about Solomon. And while you're talking to him, I will come also, so I can reinforce to you that with him that Adonijah is, installing himself as king. So Bathsheba does as Nathan counsels her, and she goes and she talks to King David. And didn't you say that my son Solomon would be king? Well, then why is Adonijah installing himself and they're celebrating? And David doesn't know anything about that. And while they're having this conversation, Nathan comes in. And evidently, when Nathan is announced and comes in, Bathsheba must leave, because Nathan then has a conversation with David in verses 22 through 27, talking and reinforcing what Bathsheba told King David. And then after that, it says that King David he sent for Bathsheba. So, I'm literally understanding that, she had gone out so that Nathan and King David could have private conversation. And so Bathsheba comes back in, and David again swears to her, that Solomon will be king after him. He says, "As the Lord lives, who has saved my life from every adversity, I have sworn to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, that your son Solomon, will be king. And he shall sit on my throne. So will I do this day." So, David is understanding that he needs to do something before he dies, or Adonijah, or however his name is spelled, Adon, I like to just call him, will usurp the kingship from Solomon. So David then calls the prophet Nathan and the priest Zadok and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. I'm not sure just who Benaiah is. I didn't take time to really try to look and find out, but I kind of scratch my head when I'm trying to think sometimes. You notice that? But anyway, so David says to these three men, take my mule, take my donkey, and have Solomon ride on my donkey, and go down and anoint him, install him, coronate him as king, and celebrate. And so they do that. They go down and they anoint Solomon, these three men and others, and they start shouting, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" And that's, Bathsheba had said that to King David too. Long live the king, King David. Well, we know that he isn't going to live forever, but every time there's a new king, it's "Long live the king! Long live the king!" and excitement. And so then Adonijah and his people have just kind of finished their feast, and they hear all of this noise of "Long live the king," and all of the shouting going on. So they come to find out, well, what's happening. And they see then that Nathan, and they have installed Solomon as king. And they probably were all aware of David's promise to Bathsheba in that way. Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to know for sure. But so they, Adonijah and all the guests were with him, finished feasting. And it says when Joab heard the trumpet, because they sounded the trumpet before they yelled, "Long live the king." So he went to find out what was going on. And it turns out that, Solomon is there and the king, and all of the guests of Adonijah get up and leave and go their own ways. And then it says Adonijah, fearing Solomon, got up and went to grasp the horns of the altar. And grasping the horns of the altar must be a safety place. I don't understand that. I can't help you out if you're wondering that either. But we're going to find that happens a couple different times that people go and grab the horns of the altar. And he says, and Solomon was informed that Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon, and he has laid hold of the horns of the altar, saying, "Let King Solomon swear to me first that he will not kill me, his servant, with his sword." And Solomon says, "Yeah, to have him come, have him go home, he'll be safe." But as David's time comes nearer to death, as we begin chapter 2, he gave Solomon instructions. He says, "I'm about to go the way of all the earth. I'm about to die. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of the Lord your God. Walk in his ways. You'll be faithful to God." And we all know that King David wasn't always faithful to God that way, but he gives instruction, that for Solomon to be faithful so that his heirs can continue the succession of kings. But within all of this, chapter 2, he tells Solomon that you need to get rid of Adonijah, you need to get rid of Joab, you need to get rid of these people that worked behind my back to install my son Adonijah to be king. And the priest Abiathar, and these men that were not faithful, were not loyal servants, loyal subjects of the king. And so when David dies, those things happen. And in some ways I can, but it's just like when David became king, then, you take care of, you dispatch, you kill all of the other heirs of Saul, other than Methuselah and Mehoabeth, the crippled son. But, it's to secrete your kingship, and it's so that these that have tried to do underhanded stuff are no longer around to get in the way, and they would have just probably caused more trouble in the future. So in the first two chapters of First Kings, we have seen the death of King David and King Solomon now becoming the king, and we'll learn a whole lot more about Solomon in the upcoming days and weeks ahead.